Size of the track with the amount of weight over one small part of it. A biomechanical foot, and there's anthropology studies in scientific journals that talk about this.
You're looking at, we're about almost 20 kilometers up Harrison Lake, at the 20-mile point actually.
The first thing that convinced me was back in 1970 when I saw and studied a pair of footprint casts from up in the north.
My name is John Green, and I've been studying Sasquatch since 1957.
6 days. That's how long a Canadian prospector swore under a signed legal affidavit that he was held captive by a family of Sasquatch in the mountains of British Columbia. Not a campfire story, not a blurry photo, a notarized statement. And to this day, no Canadian government agency has ever opened a file on it. Here's what actually happened. In the summer of 1924, a logger and part-time prospector named Albert Ostman set out alone for the head of Toba Inlet, a remote fjord north of Vancouver, chasing rumors of a lost gold claim. The indigenous guide who ferried him out warned him the last man who searched that inlet for gold was reportedly killed by something local hunters wouldn't name. Ostman laughed it off. He shouldn't have. For several nights straight, Ostman woke to find his supplies disturbed, food missing, gear moved. On what he'd later describe as his final night before planning to break camp, he fell asleep in his sleeping bag, boots on, rifle within reach. He woke up already moving. Inside the bag, being carried at speed through the forest for what he estimated was hours. He could feel the creature's shoulder under him with every step. He couldn't reach his rifle. He couldn't see anything but canvas and darkness. All he could do was count the time in his head and wait. When he was finally dumped out, Ostman found himself staring at 4 Sasquatch, an elderly male, an adult female, and 2 younger ones, watching him with what he described as calm, almost human curiosity. Not aggression, curiosity. He spent the next 6 days in their company, close enough to study their behavior, their diet, even their improvised tools, and he says the family showed no interest in harming him at all. He watched them forage. He watched the younger ones interact with what looked like simple curiosity toward him. An outsider dropped into their world with no explanation. He eventually escaped, he claimed, by offering the older male a pinch of snuff tobacco that sent the creature into a violent coughing fit long enough for Ostman to run, grabbing what gear he could reach and not looking back until he'd put real distance between himself and the camp. He told almost no one for over 3 decades. Not out of drama, out of fear that a story this specific, this strange, would end his credibility permanently in a small logging community where reputation was everything. In 1957, Ostman finally signed a formal, notarized affidavit describing the encounter in exhaustive physical detail: height, build, hair color, even the texture of their skin beneath the hair. Researcher John Green, who would go on to become Canada's foremost Sasquatch investigator, interviewed Ostman personally and came away convinced the man wasn't lying. Whatever had actually happened to him out there, Ostman never asked for money, never sold his story to a tabloid, never wavered on a single detail for the rest of his life. In 1957, Ostman finally signed a formal, notarized affidavit describing the encounter in exhaustive physical detail: height, build, hair color, even the texture of their skin beneath the hair. Researcher John Green, who would go on to become Canada's foremost Sasquatch investigator, interviewed Ostman personally and came away convinced the man wasn't lying, whatever had actually happened to him out there. Ostman never asked for money, never sold his story to a tabloid, never wavered on a single detail for the rest of his life. Green wasn't some fringe enthusiast looking for attention either. He was a respected small-town newspaper man, later the actual mayor of Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia, the kind of publicly accountable, community-trusted figure who had every reason to protect his own reputation rather than risk it chasing folklore. He spent over 50 years cataloging sightings, interviewing witnesses, and casting footprints, right up until his death in 2011. If Ostman's story was a con, it fooled one of the most methodical, skeptical investigators to ever take the subject seriously. That's strike one against the easy dismissal. Now here's strike two. 17 years before Ostman went public, a family was already living this nightmare in daylight in front of witnesses less than 200 kilometers away. September 1941, Ruby Creek, British Columbia. The Chapman family, Jeannie Chapman and her children, were home alone when her eldest son came running, insisting something enormous was coming out of the tree line. Jeannie stepped outside expecting a bear. What she saw was 7 to 8 feet tall, broad enough across the shoulders to block the light behind it, walking upright on 2 legs, like a person. It was working its way steadily closer, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world and knew exactly where it was going. She didn't stop to study it. She grabbed her children, threw a blanket over them to keep them from looking back, and ran down to the nearby village as fast as she could move, convinced the creature was coming for her kids specifically. She'd later say she wasn't running from fear of what it looked like. She was running because of how deliberately it kept coming. When the family returned home later with help, the house was untouched, but the outhouse wasn't. The creature had broken it open and gone straight for a 55-gallon barrel of salted fish inside, smashed it open like it knew exactly what was in it, and left the rest of the property completely alone. Whatever it wanted specifically, and it didn't waste time looking anywhere else. Investigators who later checked the property found a single footprint measuring roughly 17 inches, sunk deep enough into solid ground to suggest serious weight behind it. No one in 1941 was chasing fame off a Bigfoot story. There was no Bigfoot story yet. The word Sasquatch itself had only been coined 12 years earlier by a Canadian Indian agent named J.W. Burns, translating a term used for generations by the Steedsales First Nation to describe something they'd always known was out there, long before any white settler gave it a catchy name for the tabloids. 2 separate incidents, decades apart, no connection to each other, both eventually landing on the desk of the same man, John Green. Now here's where it gets stranger, and where the conspiracy angle stops being speculation and starts being documented fact. October 1955, a highway worker named William Roe is hiking alone near Tate John Cache, British Columbia, roughly 80 miles from Jasper, Alberta. In broad daylight, he watches a creature emerge from the brush less than 100 feet away and just graze, like an animal settling in for a meal. No hesitation, no fear. It didn't know he was there yet. He had minutes to study it, not seconds. Minutes. Female, by his account, with visible physical development consistent with that assessment. Silver-tipped brown hair, a sloped forehead unlike anything he'd seen on a bear, an ape, or a person. Roe would later swear, under his own signed affidavit, that the animal showed no tool use, no aggression, nothing but calm, unhurried foraging. Right up until the wind shifted, it caught his scent and it was gone into the tree line. Before he could even raise his camera, he filed his own sworn statement within days, while the memory was still sharp, rather than waiting decades like Ostman had. 2 witnesses, 2 different decades, 2 formal signed affidavits, given under their own names, with nothing to gain and, in a small working community, plenty of ridicule to lose. 3 separate witnesses now, 3 separate decades, a growing pile of physical evidence, footprint casts, broken structures, matching physical descriptions from people who never met each other, sitting almost entirely in the hands of private citizens and independent researchers, because virtually no government body in Canada has ever formally picked it up. That's not an accident. That's the actual, documented pattern. British Columbia's forests are also the backbone of one of Canada's largest industries, logging. Millions of hectares of exactly the kind of remote, old-growth terrain where every one of these encounters took place are simultaneously some of the most valuable timber and resource land in the country. A formally recognized, protected, endangered species living in that exact terrain would trigger environmental review requirements that could freeze logging operations across huge sections of the province, the same kind of regulatory freeze that's happened for other threatened species in British Columbia's history, from the spotted owl to old-growth dependent caribou herds, both of which have already forced real, multi-year logging shutdowns in specific regions once their protected status was confirmed. Skeptics call the absence of investigation coincidence. Believers call it motive. Either way, it's a real, provable fact. No Canadian federal or provincial agency has ever funded, authorized, or published an official investigation into Sasquatch reports, despite British Columbia alone accounting for more documented sightings than almost anywhere else on the continent. Think about what that would actually mean if it were confirmed tomorrow. Every active logging permit inside a designated Sasquatch habitat zone, every planned road, every clear cut, every resource extraction contract, suddenly subject to the same environmental review process that's already slowed or halted other projects over species with a fraction of the physical evidence trail Sasquatch has accumulated for an industry worth billions of dollars annually to the provincial economy. That's not an abstract inconvenience. That's the kind of finding a government agency would have every practical incentive to simply never go looking for in the first place, not because of some sweeping cover-up memo, but because nobody with budget authority wants to be the one who opens the file that could cost the province its logging revenue. Compare that to how seriously other unexplained wildlife claims get treated. When a new, unconfirmed species of frog or beetle turns up in a remote BC valley, government biologists mobilize, funding appears, survey teams go in within a season. For the single most consistently reported large-bodied cryptid on the entire continent, nothing. Not a denial, not an investigation, just silence. For over 100 years of accumulating testimony. History has actually done this before, and it's worth remembering exactly how recently. The mountain gorilla wasn't confirmed to Western science until 1902, dismissed for decades before that as exaggerated native folklore about giant ape men in the African forest. The okapi, a genuinely bizarre striped relative of the giraffe, was considered a tall tale by European naturalists until a skin and skull were finally produced in 1901. Local hunters and indigenous communities in both cases had known exactly what they were describing the entire time. It took Western institutional science literally centuries, in some cases, to catch up to testimony that had been consistent and specific from the very beginning. That's not proof Sasquatch is next on that list. It's proof that No scientist has confirmed it yet, and it definitely isn't real are two very different claims, and history has punished people for confusing them before. Here's the detail that should bother you the most. Anthropologist Grover Krantz, one of the only credentialed academics in North America who took the physical evidence seriously enough to build part of his career around it, spent decades petitioning for the Sasquatch to receive formal scientific, taxonomic consideration, not confirmation, just consideration, the same basic scientific process used for every other cryptid animal claim that's eventually been proven real, from the mountain gorilla to the giant squid, both of which were once dismissed exactly the same way Sasquatch is dismissed now. He published peer-reviewed anatomical analysis of footprint casts, arguing the dermal ridge patterns and weight distribution characteristics were extraordinarily difficult to fake convincingly with 1970s-era hoaxing techniques. He was functionally ignored by the mainstream academic establishment for the rest of his career anyway. He died in 2002, still waiting for anyone with real institutional authority to simply look at the evidence and say yes or no. The petition never went anywhere. Meanwhile, the physical evidence kept piling up in exactly the same region, decade after decade. Multiple 1970s Fraser Valley track finds, a 1990 17-inch footprint discovery on Sandspit's shoreline, found alongside heavy logging equipment that had been disturbed repeatedly over several visits. A 1991 Fort Nelson witness who compared fresh tracks directly against his own boot size on the spot and photographed the difference before it could wash away in the mud. A separate 1991 hiker's discovery of deliberately arranged teepee-style limb formations, followed by vocalizations recorded from the same clearing days later. None of it centrally cataloged by any government scientific body. All of it scattered across private researchers' personal files, van trunks, and garages. The actual, physical evidence trail of Canada's most persistent, unexplained phenomenon, sitting in cardboard boxes instead of a national research lab, gathering dust instead of funding. So ask yourself the question this story keeps circling back to. Is the total, complete absence of any official Canadian government investigation into 100 years of consistent, cross-decade, sworn eyewitness testimony really just bureaucratic indifference to an unproven folk legend? Or is it exactly what you'd expect if formally acknowledging what's actually out there in those forests came with consequences no logging-dependent provincial economy could afford to trigger? Here's the last thing to sit with. In over a century of reported encounters across British Columbia and beyond, not one has ever ended with a body, a bone, or a scrap of hard biological tissue recovered and verified. Skeptics say that silence alone should settle it. Believers point out that black bears, wolverines, and other genuinely reclusive wilderness animals go entire human lifetimes in the same terrain without leaving behind a single accidentally discovered carcass either. Proof, they argue, of nothing more than how good the deep Canadian wilderness still is at keeping its own secrets, animal or otherwise. Albert Ostman never changed his story, right up until his death. Jeannie Chapman never changed hers. William Roe never changed his. 3 different decades, 3 different regions of British Columbia. 0 contact with each other. 0 chance to coordinate a shared lie. And nearly 70 years after the last of those 3 affidavits was signed, not one Canadian government agency has ever officially opened a file to find out why.